Hello folks, this is Ralph Fleming of Fleming Recordings Nelson, makers of personal phonograph records, especially those of the Kootenay Music Festival, bringing you another program of Kootenay talent and early day Kootenay history, broadcast as a public service in cooperation with the 3 Kootenay radio stations under the titles Fleming Presents over Radio CKLN Nelson, Salute to the Kootenays over Radio CJAT Trail, and Tales of the Kootenays over Radio Ike Lougheed has been mentioned in some of our early day stories as one of the first pioneers. His version of the finding of the Silver King mine rather agrees with the story that the ore was discovered by the boys in the Hull party when they were rounding up the horses to return home. Now here's an interview with Ike Lougheed published in the Nelson Daily News on October the 19th, 1924, 40 years ago. Ike Lougheed tells of early days of Nelson, paddled down our lakes when locality was a bush-covered slope. Anderson staked site of Fairview. Tell you how Nelson appeared when I first came here in 1885? Why, there wasn't any Nelson. All I saw was the tree-covered mountain slopes where Nelson one day was to be an attractive-looking place. Oh no, it didn't look much different to any other mountain side, except that the slope was a little more gradual than in most places along the Kootenay River. Ike Lougheed was sitting in the Queen's Hotel a few days ago telling of early days in the Kootenays and of his first trip down the Arrow Lakes and up the Kootenay River. That was in the spring of 1885, the year Gordon was massacred at Khartoum, the year Louis Riel was hanged, and the year in which it was announced Gladstone's Home Rule policy. But those matters were not bothering Mr. Lougheed very much. Young and full of ardor for prospecting, he was looking for El Dorado, confident he would find it among the mountains of mineral of which rumors had reached the Canadian Pacific Railway mainline construction camps where he had been working. Rumors which the boys had discussed evening after evening around their campfires. He and Jack Evans, a kindred adventurous spirit, had paddled down the Arrow Lakes prospecting as they came. They landed at what became known as Sproat's Landing, walked beside the river to where Nelson now stands, and after some prospecting had to turn back, as they had no boat with which to travel up the West Arm. It was getting late in the season anyway, and Lougheed and Evans decided to winter at the Little Dalles on the Columbia River, south of the international boundary line, near where Northport is today. They spent the winter at a little hotel at the Little Dalles, which was run by Peter Ellison, who also kept the local store. Ellison later became watchman on the steamer Kootenay, which had been built at the Little Dalles in the spring of 1885. Captain Pinkston was the skipper, and the boat was operated between Revelstoke and the Little Dalles. It was on her that Lougheed and Evans went down to the Little Dalles in the fall of '85. Some say no steamer ever ran through the Little Dalles, but that is wrong. The Kootenay made 3 or 4 trips up and down that winter, said Mr. Lougheed. Mr. Lougheed was clear in his recollections of the early days. The romance of the discovery of the Silver King was particularly vivid in his mind. In the spring of 1886, the Hall brothers' party, led by a guide who didn't know the country, but who had hoped to earn an honest penny or two by persuading the Hall brothers that he knew of rich ore and could lead them to it, pushed up the Salmon River, having started from Colville, Washington. They soon discovered that their guide was as ignorant of the country as they were, and history does not record what happened to him. He is said to have made his way back to the States. The outcropping of the Silver King mine was stumbled on when the members of the party were seeking their horses, which they had lost. They did not stake the claims at that time because they had no miner's license. They returned to Colville, and while all the members of the party were pledged to secrecy, the secret leaked out. And next spring, when they started back to stake the Silver King, several people followed them. Jack Fox and Mike Keeley, the latter grub-staked by Aaron Kelly, arrived at the Silver King ground a day or so after the Halls had staked it. They made some locations, including the Dandy, a claim which provided Dandy Kelly with his nickname. When word reached Revelstoke of the discovery, Gilbert Malcolm Sproat, government agent, sent John Kirkup, who later became at Rossland the most famous of British Columbia government agents, to protect the interests of the province. In the meantime, Arthur Bunting of Bonner's Ferry had staked as a preemption the town site which later became Nelson. Sproat came down in 1888 and bluffed him out of it. Sproat was a justice of the peace. Judge Sproat, with the declaration that the government had previously reserved the land for a town site, was too much for Bunting, and he compromised by selling a couple of shacks he had built for $125 and got out. M.S. Davis acted for Kirkup and Sproat in buying the shacks and encouraging Bunting to quit. In 1888, Sproat named the place Salisbury, after the then Premier of Great Britain. Finding out that another place in Canada possessed this honour, Sproat renamed it Stanley, after the Governor-General of Canada. But the second choice was no more fortunate. There was another Stanley in Canada. So he dropped to a mere lieutenant governor for the third choice and named the town site Nelson after Sir Hugh Nelson, then occupant of the government house at Victoria. The name sticks in spite of the existence of a Nelson in New Brunswick. Mr. Lougheed suggests that the Nelson in New Brunswick was named after the victor of Trafalgar, so that there was no imitation as far as this town site was concerned. That was also the case of Nelson, Ontario, and Nelson, Manitoba. In the same year, Sproat instructed Harry Anderson to stake another government town site, covering what was later to become known as Fairview. Anderson was provincial constable at Hot Springs, now known as Ainsworth. It was he who arrested Sproul and who was hanged for the murder of Hamill at the Bluebell mine. Anderson staked the town site, but he recorded it in his own name, instead of it being in that of the province. Anderson sold the town site to a Victoria syndicate, including Josh Davis, Sayward, and E. Crow Baker. Harold Sellew, still a resident of Nelson, had the contract to clear the land and survey it in lots. In the winter of 1890, Davis auctioned the lots in Victoria and called the new Fairview town site the city of Nelson. In the spring of 1890, John Hewson, C.H. Inc., and Dave Allen came in from Bonner's Ferry to publish a paper, but they had to wait for some time for press and type, which had to come from Donald, where they had been publishing the truth, and which was brought in via Sproat's Landing. It was Hewson who dubbed Fairview Bogastown. In 1889, Newland Hoover staked the Hoover Addition to the south of the city as a preemption. He sold to a Vancouver syndicate, two of whom were Captain Phil Thompson and F.M. Innes. J. Fred Hume staked the Hume Addition in 1889. This was located between the original town site and Fairview. Mr. Hume, who is now Nelson representative of the Liquor Control Board, a few later became a Minister of Mines in the Semlin government. He sold the Hume Addition town site to M.S. Davis, who plotted it and sold it as lots. We will conclude the interview with Ike Lougheed. Our early day story as told by Ike Lougheed to the Nelson Daily News on April the 19th, 1924. He tells about the first steamboats, the first stores, the early history of the Silver King mine, and other items of interest. Mr. Lougheed mentioned the pioneer boats and steamboat captains. The first steamer of size on Kootenay Lake was the Galena, which was built at Sandpoint, Idaho, and used by Dr. Hendricks for hauling bluebell ore to the Pilot Bay smelter. Captain George Hayward was skipper and did all the steamboating on Kootenay Lake until the Nelson was built and operated by the Kootenay Steam Navigation Company, which consisted of J. A. Mara, J. Fred Hume, Frank Barnard, and Captain Robert Sanderson. There was never a whiter man in British Columbia than Captain Bob Sanderson. He now lives at Pinkston Creek, said Mr. Lougheed. Before the Galena was built, Dick Fry of Bonner's Ferry had a little boat called the Surprise, and there was another boat called the Mud Hen, operated by Moose Moose Davis. The Indians called him Moose Moose because he sold meat. The Mud Hen was formerly the Midge, the first boat on Kootenay Lake, brought from England by W. Bailey Groman. It had sunk one time and had filled with mud, after which it was called the Mud Hen. The first Silver King ore to be shipped out was carried on the Surprise, but Mr. Lougheed said it was a very small shipment, as the boat was a tiny affair, which had to be hauled ashore when a windstorm occurred. Returning to his own experiences, Mr. Lougheed recalled that he spent most of the spring and summer of 1886 on the Arrow Lakes. He wintered on the Pondere River, about 12 miles from the Columbia, trying placer mining. He worked at the Silver King mine for several years and left in 1900. The first store in Nelson, he said, was run by Sandy Devine and Sandy Morrow. Its site is occupied now by the provincial jail. Devine and Morrow sold out to Colonel Topping, who later went to Trail and Rossland and became famous for his connection with the Leroy mine at Rossland. Fred Hume and Bob Lemon were in partnership in 1889, having a log store near the post office. J. A. Gilker built his first store in 1890. John F. Ward was the first hotel keeper. His hotel was on land now occupied by the post office. He was followed by Mike Mahoney and McDougall. In the summer of 1888, Mr. Lougheed was blazing trail from the Haynes estate, now brilliant, to Nelson. Captain Sanderson was in charge of the party for the government. At Bonington, the Sanderson trailblazers were met by a party from the Hall brothers, who were operating the Silver King. Their idea was a direct route over the summit to the Silver King instead of up the Kootenay River to Nelson and then south. The government party followed their route in accordance with the request of the Hall brothers, who wanted to pack ore by the shortest route to the Columbia River, but only got as far as the summit. There the government grant for the trail played out. Apropos of the Hayes estate, as Brilliant was once called, Mr. Lougheed recalls that a man named Bill Hanson laboriously whipsawed 5,000 feet of lumber at this point, which was used by Bob Lemon to build some houses. "When you are prospecting, what do you live on?" Mr. Lougheed was asked. "We lived off the country," was the reply. "There was plenty of fish, deer meat, and of course we generally had bacon and beans, and a little flour." Jack Evans was an awful man to follow in the mountains, recalled Mr. Lougheed. He could pack 100 pounds, it seemed, without tiring. We were together several summers. Incidentally, Evans was the first man buried in New Denver. Jack Buchanan, Albert Irwin, Jack Evans, and I were prospecting in 1892 or 1893 near the foot of the Slocan Lake, when Evans was taken ill with what doctors have since told me was appendicitis. The party rode him halfway towards New Denver, and were driven to the opposite side of the lake by a storm which held them there for a day and a night. Next day they crossed to New Denver and borrowed a big boat from Swan Anderson and got Evans across to the Neil Ledding hotels. Irwin and I picked out a place for the grave, and it is now part of the New Denver burial ground. Evans Creek in the Slocan was named after my partner. A lasting regret of Mr. Lougheed is that he did not have a chance to take part in the Slocan rush in the winter of 1891. I was at the Silver King all winter, and when I got into the Slocan in the spring, the whole country seemed to be staked, but you needed a ladder to read what was on the notices. The claims had been staked with heavy snow on the ground, and the notices were nailed to the trees. "Why didn't you leave the Silver King before spring and take part in the rush?" Mr. Lougheed was asked. Indignation more than 30 years old flared in his eyes. "I didn't know anything about it until it was all over. I was working in the mine, and no one told me because they needed men, and didn't want me to go. That was a heck of a way to treat a man, wasn't it?" After the Silver King had been worked by the Hall brothers, the Oak brothers, Bill Miner, an Indian, Billy White, a half-breed, and John Cabaw, a Calval Asser, who was given half an interest by the Hall brothers and their associates for his services, the partners began to look around for a deal. Now, how the first deal originated is told by Mr. Lougheed. Atkinson from the South African diamond fields, a big brute of a man, accompanied by a friend, Ramsay, turned up in the fall of 1890, inspected the Silver King, and was tremendously impressed with it. But he balked at the high price that was asked. After some unsuccessful dickering, he left for Victoria. Shortly afterwards, 2 men turned up from Victoria and jumped the claims. That is, they restaked the claims illegally. Next spring, Atkinson returned to Nelson and talked a great deal about the jumping, and of the possibility that the Halls and their associates might lose the property. Finally, he and the Hall crowd made a deal under which he was to fight the lawsuit in return for what he was to get a half interest. The lawsuit never eventuated, so Atkinson got his half interest cheaply. Atkinson died at the Silver King mine. Later on, John MacDonald, a bookkeeper for the Halls, and Winslow Hall went to England and made a deal that was the beginning of the heavy development of the property. Mr. Lougheed in 1900 went to Copper Mountain and was in charge of the development work there, which paved the way for the enormous undertaking carried out by the Canada Copper Company, and he spent some years in various parts of the Boundary District. He now visits Nelson from time to time and meets old-timers he knew in the early days of the city.
Having, in a moment of weakness, consented to write a summary of the early events of the history of Nelson and the Kootenay district, I am at a loss to know what would be of interest to the readers of the Nelson Daily News. In these days, when most people use costly highways, perhaps some account of means of communication in the district would be of interest. About April the 20th, 1890, I received a wire from Montreal asking whether or not I would go to British Columbia as surgeon on railway construction for the Canadian Pacific Railway. Actuated by the spirit of adventure and an ardent desire to escape the bad roads of the section of Ontario where I was practicing, I consented, not knowing where I was going. May the 15th, I came by boat from Revelstoke to Sproat's Landing, the present site of the mill of the Edgewood Lumber Company on the Columbia. A rough pack trail extended from that point to Nelson. From the Columbia to the Slocan River, this trail followed fairly closely the course of the present highway. From the Slocan across the thickly timbered flat south of the present railway to Ward's Ferry, where it crossed to the south side of the Kootenay, and thence to Nelson. From Upper Bonington Falls, it took much the same course as the present road from the city power plant to town. There was also the old trail between Nelson and the Silver King mine. In 1890, the wagon road from Nelson to the Silver King mine was built. During the period of navigation, the steamer Galena made regular trips between Bonner's Ferry, Idaho, and Nelson, carrying both passengers and freight. The Idaho and Mud Hen were smaller craft, which roamed the river at will, and Kootenay Lake when the elements would permit. The first link of what is now the southern line of the Canadian Pacific from Medicine Hat to Hope was begun in 1890 under the name of Columbia and Kootenay Railway, a subsidiary of the Canadian Pacific Railway. It was 28 miles in length and extended from Sproats Landing to Nelson, boasting of 80 bridges of all kinds. The federal government subsidized this road to the extent of $4,000 a mile, and the provincial government made a land grant of 300,000 acres to be selected by the company anywhere in the Kootenay, in blocks of not less than 1 square mile. In September of 1891, the Slocan Silver Lead Camp was discovered, and in October and November, everybody who could rushed to the new El Dorado, seeking minerals, land, or timber. A section of country more inaccessible than that would be difficult to find. From the Kootenay Lake side, men struggled up the rough, brush-grown banks 20 miles or more before they reached the mineralized area. From Nelson, the Slocan River was the route chiefly used, although various prospectors essayed to reach the Mecca of their dreams by going up the valleys of Sproul, 6 Mile, and Kootenay creeks. Thence on 12 or 15 miles of open lakes had to be traversed in small boats, canoes, or rafts to the mouth of Carpenter Creek, where New Denver now is. Another 8 miles through trackless wilderness, over rocks and logs, through thick brush, brought them to the present site of Sandon. In company with Messrs. Wilson and Alfred Hill, the writer left Nelson on October the 28th, 1891, to the head, and were 15 days making a trip to the head of Slocan Lake and back to Nelson in an old birch bark canoe. Incidentally, there were only 3 of the 15 days in which rain did not fall sometime in the 24 hours. On the return of our party to Nelson, a public meeting was called, and money was subscribed to open a trail from Ward's Pool to the foot of Slocan Lake. The Hill brothers were in charge of the work, and by the middle of December, a passable trail was opened to where Slocan City now stands. This was extensively used during that winter, and to a lesser extent for about 2 years. In 1892, a trail was built from Caslow to Bear Lake, and thence to Sandon and New Denver. This quickly became the established route into the Slocan. About the same time, a rough trail was built from Nakusp to the head of Slocan Lake. In 1893, the Nelson and Fort Shepherd Railway was built, which afforded an all-year means of ingress and egress to and from Nelson. Prior to that, from November to April, the residents of Nelson received mail once a week, the same being brought in by pack train from Marcus, Washington, via Sproats Landing, and any person who was obliged to reach the outer world during the winter had to go on horseback to Marcus. In 1894, the Nakusp and Slocan Railway was built from Nakusp to Three Forks. In 1893, a wagon road had been constructed from Caslow to Three Forks. The year 1894 also saw the construction of a railway from Revelstoke to Wigwam, which was later extended to Arrowhead. I am not certain when the narrow gauge railway was built from Caslow to Sandon, but I think it was in 1895. In 1897, the Crow's Nest Pass line was built, the work having been finished in about August 1898. Also in 1897, the line of the South Slocan to Slocan City was constructed. In 1898-99, the Columbia and Western was built from Castlegar to Midway. I do not remember the dates of the building of the lines from Trail to Rossland, from Trail to Castlegar, and from Lardo to Girard. Since the beginning of the present century, railway work in the district has consisted chiefly of extensions and betterments of the lines built at great expense to the country to meet the demands of the residents. These same residents are equally insistent that the government spend equally large sums in the construction of costly highways to render impossible the profitable operation of the railways previously built to appease the fickle voter. When all possible roads are built, will we demand that governments build and operate lines of aeroplanes?